Number 1. There was something quietly dignified about the Rover P6. It never tried to impress you in obvious ways. It didn't roar, it didn't boast, it didn't chase attention. Instead, it stood there with a kind of calm confidence, the sort you only notice after spending time around it. In a world slowly filling with louder, flashier machines, the P6 felt almost intellectual. When it was introduced by Rover Company in 1963, it didn't just enter the market, it quietly disrupted it. Beneath its clean, restrained design was something deeply unconventional. Its engineering wasn't built for trends, but for ideas. The base unit construction, almost like a hidden skeleton beneath the body panels, was designed to protect occupants in ways most cars of the era hadn't even considered yet. It was forward-thinking, almost stubbornly so. And then, there was the way it drove. The defiant rear suspension gave it a composure that felt unnatural compared to its rivals. Where other cars bounced and drifted, the P6 stayed planted, almost as if it anticipated the road ahead. The steering wasn't overly sharp, but it was precise. The ride wasn't soft, but it was controlled. It didn't try to excite you, it reassured you. For many, that was enough. Professionals chose it not because it was exciting, but because it felt right. Police forces relied on it, trusting its stability at speed. Engineers admired it. Even ordinary families, those who could afford it, felt like they were buying something quietly superior. It wasn't a car you bragged about, it was one you respected. And for a while, that respect held strong. The Rover 2000 offered balance and refinement, while the later Rover 3500 brought a new personality entirely. The V8 transformed the car. Suddenly, beneath that calm exterior, there was power, smooth, effortless, almost deceptive. It didn't shout about it, but it was there, waiting. Owners would later remember that contrast. It looked like a gentleman's car, one recalled, but it could surprise you when you wanted it to. But time is never kind to quiet brilliance. The first signs were easy to ignore. A bubble under the paint, a faint smell of damp metal, a soft crunch when closing a door that used to feel solid. Rust didn't attack the P6 all at once. It crept in slowly, patiently, almost invisibly. By the time it revealed itself, it was already deep inside. And rust, especially in British cars of that era, was relentless. Owners tried to fight it. They really did. Weekends were spent sanding, patching, repainting. Mechanics welded sections back together, trying to preserve the integrity of something they knew was special. But the P6 wasn't a simple car. Its very innovation, the thing that made it unique, also made it harder to repair. Panels weren't always easy to source. Structural repairs required knowledge that fewer and fewer mechanics possessed. And as the years passed, parts became scarce. What was once a proud daily driver slowly became a project, and then, for many, a burden. One former owner, who had kept his car for nearly a decade, described the turning point. At first, you fix things because you love it. Then one day you realize you're fixing it just to keep it alive. That's when it changes. Another was more blunt. It was brilliant until it wasn't. By the late 1970s, newer cars had arrived. More modern, more efficient, easier to maintain. The world moved on, as it always does, and the Rover P6, for all its intelligence, couldn't escape that shift. But its disappearance wasn't sudden. It didn't vanish in a dramatic collapse or a scandal. There was no single moment where people collectively turned away. Instead, it faded, slowly, almost politely, like it lived. One by one, they left the roads. A car parked just for a while that never moved again. Another sold cheaply to someone who thought they could save it. A few stripped for parts to keep others running. Yards began to fill with them, silent, weathered, waiting for attention that would never come. By the 1980s, seeing a Rover P6 on the road was becoming rare. By the 1990s, it was almost an event. And yet those who had driven one never quite forgot it. They remembered the way it felt, not exciting in the traditional sense, but deeply satisfying. The way it seemed engineered with care, with thought, with purpose. The way it made you feel like you were part of something slightly more advanced than everything else around you. Even today, when one appears, perhaps at a quiet gathering or parked alone in a corner of a classic car show, it carries that same presence. not loud, not demanding, just there. A reminder. If you stand near it long enough, you might hear someone say something like, "They don't make them like this anymore." And they're right, not because it was perfect, but because it was different. The Rover P6 didn't disappear because it failed completely. It disappeared because the world changed faster than it could survive. And in that quiet, inevitable fading, there's something almost poetic. A car built ahead of its time, eventually left behind by time itself. Then, something smaller. Not refined, not sophisticated, but in its own strange way, even harder to forget. Something that didn't quietly fade, something people tried to forget entirely.
Number 2. There was something almost defiant about the Honda Z600. It didn't belong where it was sent. When Honda decided to bring this tiny, high-revving machine beyond Japan, it wasn't just exporting a car, it was exporting an idea. In a world dominated by long hoods, heavy steel, and engines that measured their worth in sheer displacement, the Z600 arrived like a whisper in a storm. Small, light, unapologetically different. At first glance, it almost didn't seem serious. Its compact, almost toy-like proportions made people smile, sometimes even laugh. Parked next to the massive sedans and muscle cars of the early 1970s, it looked like it had taken a wrong turn and ended up somewhere it shouldn't be. But it had its own kind of spirit. Under that tiny hood lived a high-revving engine that felt eager, almost impatient. It didn't have much power, not in the traditional sense, but it made the most of what it had. Drivers quickly learned that this wasn't a car you drove lazily. You worked with it. You pushed it. You kept the revs high and the momentum alive. And in return, it gave you something unexpected. Fun. Real, honest, lightweight fun. Owners would later remember that feeling with a kind of affection that only small, imperfect cars seem to inspire. It felt alive, one said, like it wanted to go, even if it didn't have much to give. But that charm didn't translate everywhere. In countries with wide highways and fast-moving traffic, the Z600's weaknesses became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about speed, it was about presence, or rather the lack of it. On open roads filled with large trucks and powerful cars, the little Honda felt exposed, fragile. One owner put it in words that stayed with anyone who heard them. Every truck felt like a threat. And that wasn't an exaggeration. Driving a Z600 in those conditions required constant awareness. You weren't just part of traffic, you were surviving it. Crosswinds pushed it. Passing vehicles overwhelmed it. Acceleration, once charming in the city, suddenly felt inadequate when merging onto highways. And yet, people still drove them. They drove them hard. Because if you owned a car like the Z600, you didn't treat it gently. You wrung every bit of performance out of it. You pushed it to its limits and often beyond. Engines were revved mercilessly. Components wore out faster than expected. Maintenance, while simple in theory, was often neglected. It was a car that invited enthusiasm, but couldn't always withstand it. Over time, the wear began to show. Engines grew tired. Interiors faded. Bodies, never heavily protected, began to suffer. And unlike larger, more prestigious cars, the Z600 didn't have a strong safety net of collectors waiting to preserve it. It was cheap, practical, and, to many, disposable. So when problems came, people didn't always fix them. They moved on. One by one, these little cars disappeared. Not preserved, not stored away carefully, just used up and discarded. Scrapped without ceremony. Forgotten without much resistance. By the time people began to look back and appreciate what the Z600 had been, most of them were already gone. And that's what makes it so strange today. Because every now and then, one appears. Maybe it's restored, its tiny body shining brighter than it ever did when new. Maybe it's imperfect, carrying the scars of a life lived on roads that were never built for it. But either way, seeing one feels almost unreal, like spotting something that shouldn't have survived. It looks too small for the modern world. Too simple, too honest. And yet, there it is, a reminder of a time when being different was enough, even if it came at a cost. If you ever get close to one, you might hear someone say quietly, "I can't believe these used to be everywhere." But they weren't built to last forever. They were built to try something new. And in doing so, they burned bright and brief. Further down the highway, Through the haze of memory and distance, something else begins to take shape. Not small, not fragile, but something that once looked like the future itself. Bold, ambitious, and perhaps just a little too early for the world it was meant to change. Number 3. There was nothing subtle about the Oldsmobile Toronado. Where the little Honda felt like a whisper, the Toronado arrived like a statement carved in steel. Long, low, and unapologetically bold. It didn't try to fit in. It made everything around it feel smaller, less important. Built by Oldsmobile, it was one of those rare machines that didn't just follow the rules of its time, it rewrote them. When it debuted in 1966, it carried something revolutionary beneath its dramatic body: front-wheel drive. In a world where big American cars sent power to the rear, the Toronado pushed forward, literally. It wasn't just engineering for the sake of novelty. It was a solution, a challenge, an experiment that somehow worked. And it worked brilliantly. Under the hood sat a massive V8, delivering power that felt endless. But instead of the usual rear-wheel drama, the Toronado pulled itself down the road with a strange, almost surreal confidence. There was no wheel spin in the way people expected, no fishtailing theatrics, just a steady, relentless surge forward, like a machine that refused to be unsettled. People noticed. You couldn't park a Toronado without drawing attention. Its hidden headlights, its sweeping lines, its sheer presence. It looked like the future imagined by the 1960s. Not delicate, not minimal, but powerful and optimistic. It felt like a car built for highways that stretched forever, for a world where fuel was cheap and ambition had no limits. Owners loved that feeling. It felt unstoppable, one driver remembered, like it didn't care what the road was doing. But that confidence came with a cost. The same engineering that made the Toronado special also made it complicated. Its front-wheel drive system wasn't simple. It was heavy, intricate, and unlike anything most mechanics were used to. At first, that didn't matter. The cars were new, strong, and under warranty. But as the years passed, things began to change. Repairs became more difficult, more expensive, more uncertain. Mechanics who understood the system grew rarer. Parts weren't always easy to find. And when something went wrong, and eventually something always did, fixing it wasn't just a matter of replacing a component. It often meant unraveling a piece of engineering that had been ahead of its time and now felt left behind it. And then there was the fuel. The Toronado had been born in an era that didn't worry about consumption. Big engines were a point of pride, not a problem. But the world shifted. Fuel prices rose. Efficiency became important. Suddenly, the same V8 that once symbolized freedom started to feel like a liability. Owners began to hesitate. Driving it daily no longer made sense. One former owner, looking back years later, put it simply, "It was amazing, but it belonged to a different time." And that was the truth that slowly caught up with the Toronado. It didn't fail all at once. Like the Rover, like the Honda, it faded. But its fading felt heavier, more reluctant, as if the car itself resisted being forgotten. Some were parked, waiting for repairs that never came. Others were sold, passed from owner to owner, each one hoping to keep it alive just a little longer. But complexity doesn't age gracefully, and neither does excess in a world that has moved on. By the 1980s and 90s, the Toronado was no longer the future. It was a relic of a vision that had already passed, a bold idea that worked, but only for its moment. The roads changed, the priorities changed, and slowly the big Oldsmobile disappeared from everyday life. Yet even now, when one appears, it still has that presence. It still feels important. Like a reminder of a time when car makers took risks without hesitation, when they built machines not just to sell, but to prove something. Stand next to one long enough, and you might hear someone say quietly, "They'll never build anything like this again." And they're right, because the Toronado wasn't just a car, it was an era, and eras don't come back. Then, something fragile. Something that didn't feel powerful, didn't feel unstoppable. Something almost delicate, like it could disappear not over decades, but in a single moment. Something the world barely had time to understand before it was already gone. Number 4. There was a kind of fragile romance wrapped into the lines of the Fiat 850 Spider. It didn't try to be powerful. It didn't try to dominate the road. Instead, it offered something softer, a feeling. Built by Fiat, this little convertible seemed to exist for moments rather than miles. Warm sunlight, narrow coastal roads, the quiet hum of a small engine behind you. It was never about speed. It was about experience. At first glance, it was easy to fall for. Its proportions were delicate, almost playful. Penned by Bertone, the shape had an effortless elegance. Low, clean, and inviting, it looked like the kind of car you didn't just drive, you lived with. The kind you'd take out early in the morning just to feel the air, or late in the evening just to hear the engine echo off quiet streets. Owners didn't talk about performance, they talked about how it made them feel. It made every drive feel like a vacation, one recalled, even if you were just going to the store. And for a while, that was enough. The 850 Spider became a symbol of affordable freedom, a car that didn't require wealth to enjoy the idea of open-top motoring. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was light, simple, and full of character. The kind of character that forgave its flaws. But those flaws were always there, waiting. Underneath the charm, the reality was less romantic. The materials were not built for longevity. Protection against the elements was minimal at best. And time, especially in harsher climates, was not kind. Rust didn't just appear, it spread. Quietly at first, around the edges, beneath the paint, along seams that no one thought to check. Owners would notice small imperfections, tiny bubbles that seemed harmless. But like so many cars of its era, especially those built with lightness and cost in mind, the damage was often deeper than it looked. And once it started, it rarely stopped. Mechanical wear followed its own slow rhythm. The engine, though spirited for its size, required care. Maintenance was not optional, it was essential. But not every owner was prepared for that. Some treated it like a simple runabout, forgetting that even small, charming machines demand attention. And when that attention faded, so did the car. One former owner, reflecting years later, captured the feeling perfectly. It made you smile until it started falling apart. There was no anger in those words, just disappointment. Because the 850 Spider wasn't a bad car, it was a delicate one. A car that gave a lot, but asked for something in return. Care, patience, understanding. And when it didn't receive those things, it couldn't hide its decline. By the late 1970s, many had already begun to disappear. Not preserved, not restored, simply worn out. Left behind in garages, abandoned in driveways, or quietly dismantled to keep another one alive just a little longer. They didn't vanish dramatically. They faded, gently, almost like the feeling they once created. And that's what makes seeing one today so unusual. When a Fiat 850 Spider appears now, it feels almost like a memory made real. Smaller than you remember, simpler, more fragile, and yet somehow still capable of that same quiet charm. Stand near one long enough, and you might hear someone say softly, "I had one of these a long time ago." There's always a pause after that, because they remember how it felt and how it ended. The Fiat didn't fail because it lacked beauty. It failed because beauty alone wasn't enough to survive time. And so, like so many delicate things, it slowly disappeared, not because people stopped loving it, but because it couldn't endure the world it lived in. Next, something unconventional, something that didn't follow beauty, didn't follow tradition, something that made people stop, stare, and wonder if it even belonged on the road at all. A machine that wasn't just different, it was something else entirely.
Number 5. There was something almost unreal about the way the Citroen GS moved. It didn't drive over the road, it floated above it. When Citroën brought the GS into the world in the early 1970s, they weren't just building another small family car. They were taking an idea, something once reserved for larger, more expensive machines, and giving it to ordinary people. Hydropneumatic suspension, a system that sounded complicated even when explained simply, became the heart of the GS. And when it worked, it felt like nothing else. Bumps didn't feel like bumps. Rough roads didn't disturb it. The car seemed to glide, as if separated from the imperfections beneath it by something invisible. Drivers who experienced it for the first time often struggled to describe it properly. "It's like the car is breathing," one owner once said. Another simply called it magic, because that's what it felt like. The GS didn't just absorb the road, it erased it. In a world where most small cars were basic, sometimes harsh and often noisy, the Citroën offered something almost luxurious, not in materials or power, but in sensation. It redefined what comfort could mean in an affordable car. It made long drives easier. It made bad roads feel irrelevant. For a moment, it seemed like the future had quietly arrived. But the future, as it often does, came with complications. The same system that made the GS extraordinary also made it difficult. Hydropneumatic suspension wasn't simple. It relied on pressure, fluids, precision, a delicate balance that required understanding and care. When everything was maintained correctly, the system performed beautifully. But when something went wrong, it didn't fail gracefully. It became a problem, a complicated one. Leaks appeared where they weren't expected. Components wore in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Diagnosing issues required knowledge that not every mechanic had, and as the years passed, fewer and fewer did. Owners began to notice a shift. At first, it was just inconvenience, a repair that took longer than expected, a bill that felt slightly higher than it should have been. But over time, those small moments added up. Maintenance became uncertainty, uncertainty became hesitation, and hesitation eventually became abandonment. One mechanic who had spent years working on these cars described it in a way that stayed with those who heard it. When it worked, it was magic. When it didn't, it was a nightmare. There was no middle ground. And that was the problem, because while the GS inspired genuine affection, even love, it also demanded commitment. It wasn't a car you could ignore. It wasn't a car you could treat casually. It needed attention, knowledge, and sometimes patience that went beyond what most owners were willing or able to give. So when something failed, many didn't fix it. They walked away. Cars that once floated gracefully over roads were left sitting still, their suspension sagging, their systems silent. What had once been their greatest strength became the very thing that kept them from moving at all. By the 1980s, many GS models had already disappeared, not because they were unwanted, but because they were misunderstood. Too advanced for their own longevity, too complex for a world that preferred simplicity as things aged. And yet, those who remember them don't forget. They remember that feeling, that strange, almost surreal sensation of gliding over imperfections. The way the car seemed to isolate you from the outside world, not through power, but through intelligence, through engineering that dared to be different. Even now, when a Citroën GS appears, it feels like something out of place, not because it's outdated, but because it represents an idea that never fully caught on, a different path the automotive world could have taken, but didn't. Stand beside one and you might hear someone say quietly, "I've never driven anything like it." And they're right, because cars like the GS weren't meant to be ordinary, they were meant to be something more. But being more often comes at a cost. And in the end, that cost was too high for many to bear. So the cars were left behind, not at once, but slowly, quietly, until the roads grew emptier. The road grows quieter. Engines fade into the distance. Memories linger longer than machines. And then, another memory appears. Not floating, not delicate, but something else entirely. Something that didn't just challenge expectations, it ignored them completely. Number 6. There was nothing subtle, about the Plymouth Barracuda. It didn't whisper its presence like the European machines. It didn't glide like the Citroen. It didn't charm like the little Fiat. The Barracuda announced itself, loudly, unapologetically, with a kind of raw energy that felt almost reckless even for its time. Built by Plymouth, it was born into the rising storm of American performance, when horsepower wasn't just a number, it was identity. In its early days, it was something different, not yet the fire-breathing muscle car it would become. But by the late 1960s and early 1970s, especially in its later forms, the Barracuda had transformed. It became aggressive, wide, low, tense, like it was always ready to launch forward. And when it didn't hold back. Big V8 engines, brutal acceleration, the kind of power that didn't ask for permission. It wasn't refined, it wasn't careful, it was alive in a way that felt unpredictable. Drivers didn't just control it, they wrestled with it. And they loved it for that. It felt like it was trying to kill you in the best way, one former owner laughed years later. But that kind of car comes with consequences. The Barracuda wasn't built to be preserved, it was built to be used, hard. Driven fast, raced on weekends, modified in garages by owners chasing even more power. Engines were swapped, suspensions altered, tires burned down to nothing. These cars lived intense lives, and they wore those lives openly. And back then, no one was thinking about the future. No one was thinking about rarity. They were thinking about the next race. Then the world changed. Insurance companies began to notice the risk. Prices climbed, sometimes to the point where owning a high-performance car like the Barracuda became impractical for younger drivers, the very people who had embraced it the most. At the same time, the fuel crises of the 1970s reshaped priorities. Suddenly, big engines weren't symbols of freedom anymore, they were liabilities. The shift was quick and unforgiving. Cars like the Barracuda didn't adapt well. Their identity was tied to power, to excess, to a kind of driving experience that no longer fit the world around them. Production ended, interest faded, and the cars themselves, already worn from years of hard use, began to disappear. Not carefully stored, not preserved, used up. One enthusiast reflecting on that era said something that captured the truth perfectly. We didn't preserve them, we used them. And that was the difference. Unlike some cars that slowly faded because they were too fragile or too complex, the Barracuda disappeared because it was too alive. It burned through its own existence, leaving behind fewer survivors with each passing year. By the 1980s, finding one in good condition was already becoming difficult. Many had been wrecked. Others had simply worn out beyond repair. Some sat forgotten, stripped of parts to keep others running just a little longer. And yet, those who remember them don't speak of regret. They speak of moments, of late nights, loud engines, the smell of fuel and rubber, the feeling of raw power with nothing filtering it. It wasn't a car you admired quietly. It was one you experienced completely. And maybe that's why so many are gone, because they fulfilled their purpose. They weren't meant to last forever. They were meant to be lived. Today, when one appears, restored, polished, almost too perfect, there's something strange about it. Beautiful, yes, valuable, certainly, but also distant, like a memory that's been cleaned up over time. Because the real Barracuda wasn't perfect. It was loud, rough, imperfect, and unforgettable. Stand near one long enough, and you might hear someone say softly, "These were everywhere once." And it sounds impossible now, because so few remain. Then, a quiet European shadow. Not loud, not aggressive, something restrained, something almost overlooked from the very beginning, as if it never tried to be seen at all.
Number 7. There was a quiet, almost haunting restraint in the Peugeot 504 coupe. It never tried to announce itself. It never raised its voice. In an era when cars were beginning to shout, with sharper lines, louder engines, more aggressive identities, this machine chose a different path. Built by Peugeot and carefully shaped by Pininfarina, it wasn't designed to dominate attention. It was designed to exist in perfect balance. And that balance was its greatest strength, and, quietly, its undoing. At first glance, the 504 coupe could almost seem simple. No exaggerated curves, no unnecessary details, just proportion, line, and purpose. The long hood flowed naturally into a gently sloping roofline. The rear sat low and composed. Every angle felt considered, but never forced. It didn't demand admiration. It waited for it. And those who noticed understood. It wasn't the kind of car you showed off, one former owner once said. It was the kind you kept for yourself. That feeling carried into the way it moved. On the road, the 504 Coupe didn't rush. It didn't chase speed for the sake of it. Instead, it settled into a rhythm, smooth, composed, almost effortless. The ride was controlled, but never harsh. The steering was calm, predictable. It didn't overwhelm you with sensation. It simply made everything feel just right. It was a car built for long distances, for quiet highways, for moments when the world outside seemed to slow down just enough for you to notice the details. And for a time, that was enough. But the world rarely stays quiet. By the 1970s and into the 1980s, the automotive landscape began to shift. Cars became more expressive, more aggressive. Performance figures grew louder. Design became sharper, more dramatic. Buyers were drawn towards machines that made an immediate impression, cars that stood out instantly without requiring a second look. And the Peugeot didn't change. It remained subtle, refined, reserved. At first, that felt like integrity. Later, it felt like invisibility. Because in a world that rewards noise, silence is easy to overlook. Sales were never massive. It was never the car everyone talked about. It existed in that quiet middle ground, not exotic enough to be collectible at the time, not common enough to be everywhere. It simply existed. And then, slowly, it didn't. Owners used them as intended. Daily drivers, weekend cruisers, long-distance companions. They accumulated miles, stories, small imperfections, but unlike more celebrated cars, they weren't always preserved when age began to show. Rust found its way in. Mechanical wear followed. Parts became harder to source. And without a strong wave of recognition or nostalgia to protect them, many were simply let go. Not because they were bad, not because they were unloved, but because they were easy to forget. One owner, years after selling his car, reflected with a kind of quiet regret. It was never the center of attention, and maybe that's why it disappeared. There's something deeply human in that, because not everything that matters demands to be seen. Some things simply exist quietly, until they don't. By the time collectors began to rediscover the 504 Coupe to appreciate its design, its balance, its understated elegance, many examples had already vanished, lost to time, to neglect, to the slow erosion that affects anything that isn't actively remembered. And now, when one appears, it feels different, not just rare, but almost misplaced, like it belongs to a version of the world that no longer exists. Stand beside it, and there's a certain stillness. No dramatic presence, no overwhelming emotion, just a quiet recognition that this car represents something subtle, something that didn't survive because it refused to compete for attention. It simply remained itself, and the world moved on. Then, at the very edge of memory, where even quiet things begin to fade, there is something else, not elegant, not powerful, not even quietly admired, something smaller than a memory, a shape that once existed on roads, in driveways, in passing glances, but now feels almost imagined. A car that didn't just disappear over time, it slipped through history so completely that it feels like it never truly was remembered at all. And when you try to picture it, the details don't come, only a faint outline, a name you almost recall, and the strange feeling that it's already gone.
Number 8. There was a time when the Datsun 1200 was everywhere. Not in the way that muscle cars roared down boulevards and demanded attention, nor in the way rare European roadsters inspired longing and daydreams. No, the 1200 didn't make an entrance.
It didn't arrive with a fanfare. It didn't declare itself a marvel of engineering. It simply existed, unassuming, humble, and entirely ordinary. And yet, in its ordinariness, it quietly mattered. Built by Nissan under the Datsun badge, it was a car designed to carry people, to move them efficiently, to do its job day after day without complaint. And it did so with a reliability that almost seemed miraculous in a world of temperamental machines. The Datsun 1200 was small, yes, but it was steady. Its engine, a modest, high-revving little four-cylinder, was unpretentious but honest. Its bodywork, though simple, had a utilitarian charm, a kind of practicality that didn't seek to impress, but instead promised service. Interiors were Spartan yet functional. Controls were intuitive, spaces were used wisely, and everything about it whispered, "This car exists to get you where you're going." It didn't need style to justify itself. Its presence was enough. Every morning, across countless driveways, city streets, and country roads, it was part of people's lives. Drivers learned to trust it. Families depended on it. Students and workers used it as a constant companion in their everyday lives. In small towns, it was a familiar sight. On highways, it blended seamlessly into the stream of traffic. Quiet, reliable, often unnoticed, but always there. And perhaps that is why it disappeared so completely. Ordinariness is an invisible death sentence in hindsight. While the flashy, the dramatic, the rare, and the powerful draw attention and command preservation, the quiet, the simple, the ubiquitous often vanish without remark. The Datsun 1200 was too common, too plain, too practical to be admired or hoarded. It was a car that performed perfectly, never failed spectacularly, and therefore never made headlines. Owners didn't preserve it, they drove it until it wore out. They repaired it as needed, often patching it with ingenuity born of necessity rather than care born of devotion. And when it no longer served its purpose, it was discarded, scrapped, sold for parts, or left to fade in empty lots. The car that was once everywhere gradually became nowhere. One former driver remembered it simply, almost with quiet resignation. It was just a car, until there were none left. And that is how it disappeared. Not with a bang, not with a catastrophe, but with the inevitability of time passing. Slowly, imperceptibly, the Datsun 1200 vanished. Its absence wasn't mourned by the world at large because it had never demanded attention. Its disappearance was quiet, like a candle burning out in a windless room. There was no dramatic decline, no headlines screaming tragedy, no rallies to preserve what was lost. Just the day-to-day life of a car, used and worn, and eventually gone. Yet that quiet disappearance is a story all its own. For every Rover P6 that was abandoned because rust crept in, every Honda Z600 that was pushed to its limits, every Oldsmobile Toronado that became too complex for its time, every Fiat 850 Spider that charmed and then decayed, every Citroen GS that floated and faltered, every Plymouth Barracuda that burned brightly and disappeared, every Peugeot 504 coupe that remained understated and slowly vanished, the Datsun 1200 proves that even the ordinary matters. These machines didn't all fail spectacularly. Some lived simple, long lives, giving what they could give, performing their purpose, and then quietly leaving the world behind. In a way, their very normalcy is what makes their absence feel more profound, more haunting. By the late 1980s and 1990s, the highways had emptied. Roads that had once teemed with these small, reliable machines now seemed strange in their silence. No engines hummed in steady rhythms, no headlights cut through the night in familiar patterns, no exhaust left traces of fuel and movement. The vehicles that had been the background of daily life, the faithful companions of ordinary people, were gone. Not at all at once, not violently, but incrementally, until the world had adjusted to their absence without even realizing it. And standing at the edge of memory now, the Datsun 1200 is almost unreal. Its presence is something reconstructed from stories and faded photographs. We remember the hum of its engine, the way its small tires carried it over countless miles, the way its simplicity made life easier without ever drawing notice. But mostly we remember that it was everywhere once, and now it is nowhere. These cars didn't all fail. They weren't disasters, nor did they vanish because they were flawed. They were machines that fulfilled their purpose fully.
then disappeared quietly because the world didn't need them anymore. Their loss is not one of neglect or misfortune. It is the inevitable erasure of the ordinary in a world that celebrates the extraordinary. The highway is empty now. No engines, no headlights, no exhaust trailing smoke, just the echo of machines that once filled these roads with life. The hum of their engines, the rhythm of their tires on asphalt, the soft whisper of metal moving through space, all of it gone. And in that emptiness, there's a strange kind of reverence, because these cars, every Rover, Honda, Toronado, Fiat, Citroen, Peugeot, and Datsun, remind us that not all greatness is loud, not all brilliance survives attention, and not all stories need fanfare to matter. Some stories exist in the quiet, the ordinary, the countless machines that did their jobs without complaint and then slipped away, leaving only shadows, whispers, and memory. And now, looking down that empty highway, you realize it. The ordinary can vanish faster than the extraordinary, and yet, in vanishing, it leaves the deepest impression. The roads are silent, yes, but the memory of these cars echoes endlessly. The world they moved through is gone. The engines no longer roar, the headlights no longer flash, and yet, in the mind's eye, they still exist, driving, humming, alive for a moment longer before disappearing into memory itself.